Hi guys, and welcome to activity 2 in the year 8 physical sciences course. Now in the last activity we looked at what energy is. In this activity we're going to look at how energy is measured, and I'm going to give you a few skills that you can use. These skills won't only work for this unit, but you can find throughout your science some of these skills. If you pick them up here, you'll be able to use them throughout, and life will become a lot easier if you learn them quickly here and as you go on through your science career, and even in other subjects such as maths. You'll find that some of the conversions that we're going to be doing in this unit will make life a lot easier for you. So it's quite an important activity to work through here. Okay, so let's get started. Well, how is energy measured? Well, it was first, and a lot of work was done by the scientist James Prescott Joule, and he did a lot of work on energy, and as a result the science fraternity honoured him by naming the unit for energy after him. And you will find throughout, as you study science further and further on, that certain scientists are honoured by having their surname used as a unit to basically, the unit is set up to follow what they were studying. So for example, Newton did a lot of work on force, so the unit for force is called the Newton. Joule did all the work on energy, so as a result he basically is given the prefix, or the unit for energy is joules. Okay, so as we go through your science, you'll sort of say, well, where does that name come from? And it's basically to honour the scientist who did a lot of work into that area. So James Joule is basically linked with the early work on energy. So what you must understand is, when you're dealing with energy, and you're using numbers, you must always put a capital J as the unit after the value of energy that you're trying to express. It's really important that you do that. Okay, now what we find is that a lot of numbers that we use are really big. So to try and help us out so we don't have to write incredibly long numbers, we put prefixes on the unit. Now these prefixes are fairly easy to understand. You just have to learn them. Now we've got two prefixes that we're going to use in this unit, and that's the kilo and mega. Now you've used these before. For example, if you deal with kilometer, kilometer. Kilometer means 1,000 meters. When we talk about mega, you've done this a lot, and I'm sure you've heard of this with respect to megabytes. 1 byte is a small piece of computer information. Megabytes is 1,000,000 pieces of information. You've heard of gigabytes and telebytes, etc., etc. So all these are prefixes. On the other side, we can get smaller by using things called milli. You've come across millimeter, micrometer, micrometer, nanometer, picometer. These are all prefixes that go at the front of the unit and either make the unit smaller, or they can make them bigger depending on what we're trying to do. Okay, so in this unit we're going to use the idea of the kilojoule, and there will be an example of a megajoule, just to see how well you've picked this up. Now, all we need to understand is that a kilo will have a K next to the unit. So instead of having joules, we'll have kJ, which means kilojoules. That means 1,000 joules. So 1 kilojoule is 1,000 joules. 1 megajoule is 1,000,000 joules. So what we need to be able to do is to convert from joules to kilojoules, and then from kilojoules back to joules again. Because what you'll find is that in a lot of your assessments, to test this, they will say, express this answer in the form of kilojoules, or express it in the form of joules. And it's going to happen the same when we start looking at more complicated stuff like kilometers and meters. And when we look at speed, we might have kilometers per hour, or we might have meters per second, and you have to be able to convert between the two. So let's start simply by looking at how we convert, in this case, from joules to kilojoules. Remember, it's the kilo which is important. Now remember, kilo means 1,000. So it's very, very simple. You just follow this rule. Find the value that you've got in joules and basically divide it by 1,000, and that will give you the answer in kilojoules. So let's look at an example. Here we want to convert 25 joules and work out what it is in kilojoules. How many thousand joules of it is it? So all we have to do is to take our value. In this case, our value is 25, and we're going to divide it by 1,000. So dividing it by 1,000 basically gives us 0.025. Put it into your calculator if you're not sure. 25 divided by 1,000 comes out to 0.025. Or you can work on the idea that 25, the decimal point is by the 5, so we have to move the decimal point 3 spaces to the left. Now if you move that decimal point 3 spaces to the left, because we're dividing, that number is now getting smaller, and because we've got a space, we put a 0 between the decimal point and the 2. I hope that makes sense. If you don't understand that, then I'm sure you've already done number lines in mathematics. Go back and see your maths teacher and just work on the idea of when we try to divide by something, we always go to the left with the decimal point. And if we're trying to multiply by something, especially when tens, hundreds, thousands, we move the decimal point to the right. It's that simple. Okay, so that allows us to convert from joules to kilojoules. We always divide by 1,000. Let's go the other way. How do we convert from kilojoules to joules? Now, obviously, kilojoules is 1,000 joules. So when we convert from kilojoules to joules, the number must get bigger. When we go from joules to kilojoules, the number must get smaller. So when we go from kilojoules to joules, we multiply the value in kilojoules by 1,000. So let's take our same example here, where we've got 25 kilojoules and we want to know how many joules there are in there. So it's 25 times 1,000 gives us 25,000 joules. Okay, so again, you can put that into your calculator. 25, hit the multiply sign, and then 1,000, hit the equals, and you'll get 25,000. Or you can do it in your head. Remember, the decimal point is by the 5. Okay, and in this case, when we're multiplying by 1,000, we're going to move the decimal point 3 spaces to the right. So that means because we've got 3 spaces, we substitute zeros in. So you can see here, if you take imagine that in the 25,000 joule answer, if you imagine that the decimal point is by the comma, move it 3 spaces to the right, and in the spaces put zeros, you can see where the 25,000 joules comes about. So converting joules to kilojoules, we divide by 1,000. Converting kilojoules to joules, we multiply by 1,000. Alright, so let's have a little go and see if you can get this right before you go on and do some exercises. So in the first 3 examples I've got here, you have to convert from joules to kilojoules. So remember, when we go from joules to kilojoules, we divide by 1,000. I suggest you pause the video now and have a go at those 3, and then we'll go through it. So pause it now. Okay, welcome back. So let's see how we did. So in the first example, we've got to divide 137 joules by 1,000 to get it into kilojoules. So if we put that into our calculator, it's going to be straightforward. If we haven't got a calculator, we move the decimal point, which is after the 7, 3 spaces to the left. So we end up with an answer of 0.137 kilojoules. Notice the kj after the numbers. Must always put the units after the numbers. In the second one, we're going to convert 2,345 joules into kilojoules. So you can stick that into your calculator and then divide by 1,000, or You can move the decimal point, which is just after the 5. Remember, we're dividing, so we move it to the left. We move it 3 spaces because we're dividing by 1,000. So we end up with 2.345 kilojoules, kJ after the number. Finally, more complicated, we've got 0.97 joules, and we're going to convert it into kilojoules. So this is going to be a wee bit more complicated. If you've got your calculator, you just put 0.97 divided by 1,000 and hit the equal sign. Or if you haven't got a calculator, find the decimal point. In this case, it's between the 0 and the 9, and we must move it 3 spaces to the left. And any spaces that we've got which have not got a number in, we put a 0. So the answer ends up as 0.00097 kilojoules. Okay? Alright, so I hope you did well on that one. Let's look at these 3. Now in this case, we're going in the opposite direction. So pause the video now and go through those answers and see how you do in a second. Okay, welcome back. So let's see what we did. Remember, when we go from kilojoules to joules, the number needs to start getting bigger. So we've got to multiply by 1,000. And in this case, what we can do, in the first example, we've got 47 kilojoules. So you can put 47 into your calculator times 1,000 and hit the equals button. Or you can move the decimal point, which is just after the 7, 3 spaces to the right. Remember, we move it 3 spaces to the right and put zeros in the spaces because we're getting bigger. Alright, so we end up with 47,000 joules. So example 2, 9.8 kilojoules into joules. Remember, 9.8 times 1,000, or move the decimal point 3 spaces to the right because we're multiplying by 1,000. So we move it 10, each column is a 10. And so what we end up with is 9,800. And then finally, in example 3, again a little bit harder, 0.027 kilojoules into joules. So you put 0.027 times 1,000 equals in your calculator, or you move the decimal point 3 spaces to the right, which means that the decimal point ends up just after the 7, which means we end up with 27 joules. Okay, well I hope you were successful on those. If not, go back, do them again. Look, practice makes perfect. Not everybody's going to get it straight away, but as long as you keep practicing, that's going to be good. Now in this unit I've also put some exercises for you to have a go at. So have a go at those and do check the answers. If you don't get it, watch the video again. Okay, well thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you soon.